And now I'd like to introduce our next keynote speaker. It is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Ron Ross, a fellow at NIST. Dr. Ross is a leading expert in cybersecurity, system security engineering, and risk management, and he leads the development of crucial cybersecurity standards and guidelines for the federal government and critical infrastructure. And he supports international cybersecurity initiatives. On a personal note, I'd like to say that over the last 20 years or so, Dr. Ross has been a true partner to the healthcare sector, bringing to bear his expertise and NIST's collective knowledge to help us deal with the daunting challenges we all face in this space. So we really appreciate his collaboration. Dr. Ross, welcome, and I'll turn it over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Lisa. And it's just been a pleasure to listen to all the presentations today. I'm going to try to capitalize on what we've all heard so far and talk about some of the things NIST is working on. We've been working on these things actually for a long time. But I think when you listen to all the presenters today, you get a real sense of how difficult and challenging the problems are protecting systems in what has become the modern era of cyber and physical convergence, where everything today has computers pushed into them as part of the overall cyber physical system, whether it's a medical device or a healthcare administration system, or everything is connected to everything with IoT and IT systems, operational technology. The common denominator is the computer system is the nerve center for all of these things. And we're dealing in a world of incredible innovation. The innovation is almost unbelievable. Every year that goes by, we have more and more capabilities, and now we're seeing artificial intelligence and machine learning and things taking things to the next level. And all of this innovation and new technology really helps us be more productive. It helps us in the healthcare industry to save patients' lives and to just bring value to society. But on the other side of that coin, this incredible complexity that we're seeing today in the hardware, the software, the firmware, and the systems. And you're hearing it in all of the presenters' talks today about they're using the technology to the maximum extent. And yet, the adversaries see this technology. If you could go to the next slide, I'm just going to kind of roll into this whole discussion of attack surface and of course, the complexity issue. But our systems, despite the technology, are what I would call fairly brittle, which means that it's hard to take an initial attack or a punch, and you can't control what the adversaries do. Those attacks are going to come at the frequency and the intensity of whatever the adversary wants to throw at you. Our job on our side is to develop systems that are defensible. And that whole notion of defense in the past 40 years has largely been penetration resistance. You pretty much try to harden the exterior boundary, the outer shell of the system, and then hope for the best. And so we know that one-dimensional strategy of penetration resistance, although it does represent a lot of best practices, the 80% solution, the blocking and tackling, those things are still good to do. But now we're looking at the kind of the secondary problem. And if you can go to the next slide, I talk about complexity of hardware, software, and systems. And you've heard the term attack surface used quite a bit today. Attack surface is what the adversary can see, what they can do to get beyond that initial set of boundary defenses. And once they're inside your system, as you've heard from the other presenters, they can do a lot of things. And we're going to talk about how we organize for battle in this modern era of this incredible innovation, technology, very powerful computer systems, and the ability to save data, store data, and lots of data in all of our systems. And by the way, it's a really good thing to emphasize that customers are always on the ends of the ends of these attacks and get blamed for a lot of these things. But in reality, many of these problems are beyond what customers can deal with. We're talking about incredibly smart adversaries. They're well-resourced. They have all the attack tools that you could ever hope to have. And so, we're left with, as consumers, trying to defend our systems. And this is another important point I want to emphasize today. Protecting our nation, our critical infrastructure, which has 16 sectors. The healthcare sector is one of those sectors. It's a very large sector. has lots and lots of resources. It represents a huge part of our gross domestic product. And so all of those things coming together now, the solutions to our problems are going to have to move beyond our traditional one-dimensional view of this problem. And we're going to have to go to some things that are a little more nuanced. And this is where government, industry, and the academic community, I call this the essential partnership. And as I go through the talk today, you're going to see how we're going to have to start looking below the surface. I talk about popping the hood of the car and looking at the engine and understanding how the engine is put together. Because the adversaries, as you've seen in some of the previous presentations, that attack chain they go through is very, very well documented. We know exactly how they get into the systems. We know what they can do once they get inside. So how can we make things better? Looking at this problem from an engineering and an architectural perspective. You heard about zero trust. We're going to talk about those things today and see how we can make these things a little bit more difficult for the adversaries. Next slide, please.
Dr. Ross, can you hold on for a second? It looks like just having a sharing of my session slides.
Sure.
Give me one moment. Apparently, just give me a second to troubleshoot.
So while Carol's getting the next slide up, when we talk about architecture and engineering, we're basically trying to see what can we do if the adversary gets into our system. And the example I like to use, as someone said earlier, you have a lock on the front door of your house. Sometimes you have 2 or 3 locks, you have a deadbolt. But once the adversary kicks in the front door and they move into your house, they can go through every room in your house and basically steal all your stuff, all your valuables. So if you can, with this slide, I'm going to kind of roll this slide into this current discussion. We talk about having the ability to affect the adversary once they're inside your system, but most of our work today is focused on the hostile cyber attacks. That's the fourth element. Once the adversaries that can get into your systems, they can do a lot of things, but there are other things in the threat space that Ryan referred to today that is not just about hostile cyber attacks. We also have the notion of physical devices failing. We've seen in Florida and in California recently, we have the disasters, man-made disasters. There are things like hurricanes, tornadoes, fires that can damage facilities and all of your networks and your systems. And then you've seen some very, very high visibility stories recently about what happens when good people in systems, they do bad things. And then the next thing you know, you've made a modification to some critical software element and it goes out to 140,000 customers. And next thing you know, the airports are shutting down. So this shows how connectivity and the powerful nature of our computing systems can really do some damage. So if you go forward one slide and I'll go to the next slide. So I'm going to talk today about this thing called a multi-dimension protection strategy. Hardening the target would be doing everything that you've heard about in the traditional security controls and things like that.
I'm sorry, Dr. Ross. There's a problem with the slide deck. So I'm going to have Lisa share her desktop and see if that helps. My apologies. So
yeah, go ahead. We're talking about multi-dimension protection strategy, and while we're getting those slides up there, I'll just kind of talk you through it. And what we're talking about is if the adversary does get through that initial perimeter defense, what can we do to limit the damage they can do once they're inside the system? And that's a pretty important question to ask today. Okay, so we can go to the next slide now, Lisa, I think. Keep going forward. One more. And one more. Right, so we're talking about limiting the damage, and we're going to talk about 2 different ways you can limit the damage. And everything I'm going to talk about today, some of these things get a little bit more complicated, but I've got some resources listed on my last slide there are some automated tools that you can download for free that can help you understand all of the architecture and engineering concepts we're going to talk about today, and things that you can do ultimately to make that system this is the target the adversary is after, to make it more resilient. And that's really important because we after 2 decades of experience now and looking at all the data, we know we can't stop these cyber attacks, especially for adversaries that are on the high end, maybe the nation state level resources that are really difficult to stop. Next slide, please. So the 2 ways that we can limit damage, and there's been some reference to these today, you can limit it in time and space. When the adversary has an attack chain they're executing, they need time on target. And so one of the things we can do is use things called virtualization, where when you stand up a virtual machine, or now we can even micro virtualize pieces of software. And what that means is those pieces of software, those systems are stood up for a period of time. And so over time, any system can have malware that makes its way into the system. The question is, can I reinstantiate that software or that piece of software or code or that system or that segment fast enough to get rid of the malware and basically cleanse the system, bring it back to a known secure state. The other thing we can do is to stop the lateral movement or slow down the lateral movement. We talk about, as you heard earlier, zero trust architectures really take those that single perimeter on the outside of the system and break it down into smaller domains. And each of those domains then have security measures attached to them, whether it's access control, authorization, or encryption, or monitoring. And when you break those things down into smaller and smaller pieces, it makes the adversary have to go through more steps to get access to the critical information. That kind of bleeds into this notion of domain separation, where we try to separate things into domains because we then can take the more valuable information, whether it's patient healthcare data or whether it's, they were talking about the cancer treatments and things like that. Everything has value, but certain things have a higher priority, have more value, and those things need to be put into separate domains so they can be better protected. Next slide, please. Okay, I think on this one, we also talked about segmentation and micro-segmentation. Again, we have the ability with the technology today to break down not only our networks, but the basic pieces of the system into very small pieces. And that segmentation is a very powerful tool to allow us to kind of spread our risk out across the system so that one attack in one place can't bring down the entire system, as we've heard today, that can be devastating to the organization. Next slide, please. So the concept of resiliency, it's fairly easy to understand. Not always easy to implement, but it's the ability to understand what the attacks look like, the threat space, and then anticipate what the adversary can do to you, and then use good architecture and engineering constructs to be able to build up that system's defenses. It's kind of like the human body. We're trying to make this very brittle system act more like the human body, where every day we deal with viruses and we deal with bacteria, and our immune system has the ability to absorb those things and, for the most part, push them back. Occasionally, if you have cancer or things that really can hurt the body, they even overwhelm our best immune systems. But for the most part, there's a lot of things we can do to make these systems more cyber resilient, to be able to withstand the attack and then slow down the adversaries, limit the damage, and then eventually recover from that attack and then learn from those things to adapt to the next generation of attacks that may occur. Next slide, please. So these systems today are incredibly complicated. The hospital systems that you see, even the medical devices, this graphic came out of our engineering guideline. We have 2 guidelines that NIST has produced going back to 2016. The first one, where this graphic comes from, talks about building more trustworthy, secure systems in a life cycle approach. And this graphic illustrates how systems look. The system of interest, and this could be a smartphone, it could be an iPad, it could be a hospital administration system, but that system of interest has many different system elements within that blue triangular boundary. And those could be applications, they could be middleware, they could be operating systems, they could be network devices. All of those are system elements. They could even be people, processes, and procedures. But the important point is all of those elements work together to give that system a capability. And then on the outside of that perimeter, you're interacting with other systems. Some of those systems are necessary to have your system fulfill its mission. Other times you're just communicating with customers or other business partners in the overall ecosystem. But the important point is that from an architecture and engineering perspective, we have to understand what's inside that blue triangle and how that adversary looks at that as attack surface and what we can do to make sure that system is as resilient as it can be. Next slide, please. This is volume 1 of our engineering guidance. This basically has to do with how do you build a more trustworthy system from the start. And you can see there are the classic life cycle processes, starting with mission business analysis and going through all the way through the architecture definition, design definition. That's we get into zero trust architectures and some of the things that there are lots and lots of guidance documents on out there. But this, again, is not something you can build overnight. 95% of our systems in the federal government, and this is probably true in the healthcare sector, are installed base legacy systems. So in the Army, we used to have a saying, you go to war with the Army that you have, not the Army that you want. And what that means is that whatever system you're looking at today on the ground, you've got to be able to do some things to make that system more secure, more resilient. And so we're going to talk about our second volume that we produced that's going to talk about the specific things that you can do to make these systems more resilient. Next slide, please. In our volume 1, there are some fundamental security design principles that you would recognize a lot of these because some of these design principles have appeared in things like our cybersecurity framework, our NIST 800-53, the security controls document. You'll recognize things like least functionality, least privilege, domain separation. These are all things that have a higher level principle behind them. And when you're building a system from the start, whether it's a piece of critical software or whether you're designing the architecture to bring various software modules together, a lot of these fundamental principles can ensure that that system can withstand cyber attacks, or if the attack gets through, the attack is going to be impeded in some way. And a lot of these things are actually not difficult to do, but there's a lot of pressure today because of the way the systems are designed, the software. There's maximum functionality, and that kind of goes against one of our core principles of least functionality, where every application, every device, you try to have the minimum number of functions, ports, protocols, services in that environment. So only the things that are necessary for mission success are on that system at any one point in time. That involves limiting the attack surface. You give the adversary fewer things to attack. So, but it's not easy to do. And anybody who's got a smartphone will understand that. Look at your average smartphone. There are hundreds of applications on that phone. Many of those applications, you have no idea who developed those apps, where they're coming from, and what kind of connectivity brings in malicious code to that device. That's what CISOs and system architects struggle with every day. Other principles like least privilege, only giving privileges to people who need them. Again, these things sound fairly easy, but if you have to execute every day on the ground, they become more difficult. And that's where some of the tools that you heard about today are really important to help our enterprises deal with all of this complexity and do the right thing and try to reduce that attack surface where they can. Next slide, please.
Ross, can you explain the difference between micro-virtualization and micro-segmentation?
Yes, microsegmentation is breaking down the pieces of the piece of software or the system or the network into various pieces that you decide. And each of those segments can be broken down for different reasons. Maybe it's the criticality of what that segment is doing. And that's kind of an articulation of the principle of domain separation. So you're able to break down the network into various segments so you don't have that ubiquitous connectivity, as the gentleman described earlier. Sometimes connectivity is good, but many times that connectivity is not that good. Now, Virtualization is it's kind of a way to, in the context of a computer system, when you stand up a virtual machine or a micro virtualization piece of software, it's a piece of software that you can bring on board and then take offline. And it appears to the user as they have control of the entire system, but they're really working in their own virtual piece of the world. Now, what makes that powerful is that you can bring up virtual machines very quickly. You can bring up pieces of software that are micro-virtualized very quickly, and allows you to refresh those components more quickly. And why is refreshing important? Because over time, your system is likely going to be experiencing some level of malicious code. Either you're going to know about it, or it's going to be sitting there to be triggered at a time of the adversary's choosing. So one of the things that we'd like to be able to do is flush out the system on a routine basis. The question of how often do I do that, and how difficult is it, and how disruptive? So these are all things that are trade-offs that someone talked about earlier as being part of risk management. But that's really, we use those tools together. Segmentation and virtualization work together in that space and time that I talked about earlier to really make the adversary's life more miserable once they're inside your environment. So the next thing we talk about, and I'm going to have to watch the clock here because I know we've got up, we up on 3 o'clock here, we have to be completed. But the next volume, volume 2 of NIST 800-160, is about cyber resiliency, and we developed a framework. It's called the Cyber Resiliency Engineering Framework. It's very intuitive. It's very hierarchical. It talks about if you want to do all those things in our definition of resiliency, where you're anticipating, you're withstanding, you're recovering, and you're adapting. This framework allows you to pick certain goals and objectives for what you want to achieve to get resilience as part of your system or your environment of operations. And then we also have literally a dozen or so cyber resiliency techniques that we've defined. And then each of those has one or more implementation approaches. So you can now see, you can customize your cyber resiliency solution. And I've got that link to the tool in the back that can help organizations do that. But you can see that there's a lot of things that you can do, even with systems that are part of your installed base, that are legacy systems that you can't swap out or you're going to be upgrading over time. We now have the ability to bring some near real-time solutions to help you make that system as resilient as it can be before you upgrade, do the major upgrade, or go to the next generation technology. Next slide, please. So here are the list of the techniques that we use. And again, I don't want to dwell on these. I just want to give you a flavor of some of the things that make up our kind of arsenal of cyber resiliency techniques. You can see one of those is called diversity. Not having a single type of operating system or a single type of application or a single antivirus tool or a single type of monitoring system, which can be a single point of failure. So diversity of applications and systems can be a real game changer and help you avoid that single point of failure, which brings down the entire enterprise. We'll talk a little bit about non-persistence in a minute, so I'll save that one. We talked about segmentation. Substantiated integrity is critically important, especially with medical devices. As you're moving information from the device to the back end where that information is processed, making sure the information hasn't been modified somewhere in that process. Confidentiality, integrity, and availability, the 3 pillars of cybersecurity, all work their way into these cyber resiliency techniques. Next slide, please. I picked non-persistence because we talk about the ability to store data and the massive ability that we've had such advancements in storage technology gives us the ability to store vast quantities of data and move vast quantities of data around the network and around our systems. And so one of the techniques that we have is called non-persistence, and that means get rid of all the information that you don't need. The best example I can use in this type of attack was the OPM attack in 2015, where one of our adversaries went into the system that had all the security clearance data that our federal government used to assess whether somebody should get a security clearance, some of the most critical data that was ever stored on individuals. And that information was stolen in one fell swoop from this one system at OPM. So all of the background information that was in there on individuals, much of that data could have been moved to a more secure location. You talked about protecting backups. There are ways to architect and engineer backups so it's not susceptible. Even if the adversary gets in, they can't find those backup locations. And even if they did find the backup location, they couldn't get in because the information is encrypted. It's in multiple sites. There's redundancy, there's diversity. So all of these things, and non-persistence can apply to information. It can apply to services and also to connectivity. We found also that during that time after the OPM breach, DHS did a study about the number of connections in the federal government. The vast majority of connections didn't have to be there all the time. And so again, we're talking about this notion of attack surface and just limiting connections and data and applications to get that attack surface as small as you can make it so it gives the adversary less room to maneuver, so to speak. Next slide. All the design principles in that volume 1, which are part of the lifecycle design process, those are all traceable to all of the different cyber resiliency techniques and the approaches that we have in volume 2. So again, when you're talking about protecting systems, we're going down to a different level of architecture and engineering. And again, this is not going to be something we can solve overnight, but understanding that our long-term solutions are going to be based on architecture engineering, disciplined systems engineering practices and principles, because that's how you build a better engine, a better automobile. And that's the way we're going to build systems that are more secure, more trustworthy, and at the end of the day, more system and cyber resilient. Next slide, please. There's a lot of talk about what is adequate security. Every CISO and every organization, and we talked about this earlier in some of the presentations, it's all about cost, schedule, and performance. We have limited budgets, limited resources. So how many security controls, how much engineering do I need to do? One of the things we learned from NASA in our collaboration with them in this publication that we're talking about today is NASA has a notion of adequate safety. They're doing lots of things that are very dangerous, going into space, flying astronauts to the moon, bringing them back. How much safety do we need in a spacecraft? Well, they've got a way to deal with that. They're dealing with human lives, and they have a process, they call it adequate safety. And we brought that into our NIST publications, and we call it as secure as reasonably practicable. And what that means is, if you look at the graph here in this chart, going from that data point A all the way up to data point D, every system, when you first design the system, you can put in lots of safeguards and countermeasures and security controls, very inexpensive. The basic blocking and tackling, you might want to call it cyber hygiene. But then how many things do you do above that? How much more valuable is your data, the patient healthcare information? How many more safeguards do I need to manage that risk dealing with a threat environment that Ryan talked about earlier? Well, you might want to move up to the next data point where you can still add some things, still cost effective, and you move up that curve, adding additional safeguards and countermeasures, doing better engineering, doing things that are more disciplined and structured, making sure you have greater assurance. But at some point, the addition of safeguards and countermeasures not only becomes extraordinarily expensive, you don't get the return on investment. And that's what I call the sweet spot. It's right under that data point C. And that's the sweet spot that every organization is going to have to find. There's no common solution because every sector in the critical infrastructure sectors is different. Healthcare is different than the defense sector. It's different than the transportation sector. But using the process of going through and looking at cost, schedule, performance, the threat space, anticipating all the things we talked about, you will find that sweet spot. And that's where managing risk really should be focused today. Next slide, please. The last one I'm going to talk about is transparency. The reality is that all this technology, all this innovation, we basically buy things off the commercial products list. That's where all the innovation is. And it's critical that our technology developers be as transparent as they can. We have to understand how these different systems and components and capabilities, how are they developed? What kind of processes did they use? Did they use secure coding techniques? Are they using computing languages that help us, build better software that has fewer vulnerabilities or fewer weaknesses and deficiencies that can become vulnerabilities. So I talk about this thing called the black box. That can be your smartphone, that can be the healthcare system, the back end, the front end, the medical device. It's all about what's in the black box that gives you a capability. And understanding what's in the black box, the applications, the middleware, the operating system, how trustworthy are these individual system elements, and how much information can industry give to us so we can make good decisions on what kind of products should I buy, which ones are more trusted. That transparency and traceability from top level requirements all the way through the lifecycle process till you get a capability out the back end. We cannot fly blind in this world that we're building today. Complexity gives us the good things about, serving patients and helping save lives, but it also gives us the reality of looking under the hood of that engine and seeing the complexity of the engine and what we have to do to make sure that engine can be reliable and operate under conditions of great stress. So again, thank you so much for allowing me to present today. And you can contact me on the last slide. We have contact information on that last slide. Please give us a call. Anything you don't understand about any of the things we talked about in the publications, these are the links to all the pubs I talked about today. That third link there is the automated tool that allows you to take the details out of the NIST pubs and use the automated tool to help you go through and design something that works for your organization. Thanks again for your time, and I'll turn it back over to you, Lisa, for the rest of the presentations.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Ross. Very informative. I'm going to turn it back over to Frank to moderate the next session. Thanks, Dr. Ross.
Thank you. Take care.